You can support In the Past Lane with as little as $1 a month. Just go to the support page at our website, inthepastlane.com. Thanks. I have only one distinct memory from second grade. Our teacher, Sister Mary something or other, was furious at us for not standing perfectly still during the Pledge of Allegiance. I can still see her now, gripping her pointer with white knuckles and chastising us for being unpatriotic, like, as she said, those two disgraceful men at the Olympics who shamed their country during the National Anthem. We had no idea what she was talking about. But many years later, I realized she was ranting about John Carlos and Tommy Smith, who raised their fists in the Black Power salute at the 1968 Olympics. I was in second grade in 1971, so 3 years after that incident, this nun, like millions of other white Americans, was still seething over a protest by black athletes. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hi there, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 51, in which we talk to historian Lewis Moore about the long and complicated history of African-American athletes in the United States. We are coming to you this week from the Cassius Clay Studios, located in central Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com, and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our new YouTube channel. Keeping us from throwing in the towel is our inspiring executive producer, Lulu Spencer. So what's happening at In the Past Lane this week? Well, the semester at my college is underway, so that's keeping me rather busy. And since I'm situated here in New England, there's a lot of excitement building about the Super Bowl this coming weekend. I know, the rest of the country hates the Patriots, but cut me a little slack here, people. I've loved the Pats since I was a little kid, when they were inarguably the worst team in the NFL, with the worst owner in the NFL, playing in the worst stadium in the NFL. So yes, your historian at large will be rooting on the Pats when they square off against the Philadelphia Eagles this Sunday. In other, more history-related news, just 2 days after the Super Bowl, on February 6th, PBS will air a new documentary in its long-running American Experience series. It's called The Gilded Age, and I was lucky enough to be included as one of the on-camera historians. There's a lot of interest in this documentary, because for more than a decade, there's been a lot of talk in the U.S. about this current era being a so-called second Gilded Age. Because of this, people want to know, what are the parallels between the Gilded Age of the late 19th century and today? Well, there are two ways you can find out. One, watch the documentary on Tuesday, February 6th at 9 p.m. Eastern. And two, listen to the upcoming Gilded Age episodes of In the Past Lane. Don't forget that you can support In the Past Lane via Patreon, and that you can really help us out by telling your friends about In the Past Lane. Okay, people, everything's packed for the tailgate, so hop in. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. The early 20th century boxer Jack Johnson was a larger-than-life figure. He was rich, having won huge prizes by defeating all comers in the boxing ring, and earning endorsements for all kinds of products. He was flamboyant, too, driving expensive cars, wearing fancy clothes, and flashing gold-capped teeth. He was without question the most famous athlete in America. There was only one problem. Jack Johnson was black. And his success and his flashy lifestyle infuriated white Americans. This was the age of Jim Crow and the color line, an age animated by the creed of white supremacy. All across the nation, not just in the South, white Americans were implementing laws and policies that segregated African Americans and cut them off from economic opportunity and political power. Making blacks poor and powerless upheld the fiction of white supremacy. So when Jack Johnson became heavyweight champion in 1908, white Americans reacted with panic and rage. And that sentiment only grew more intense as Johnson reveled in living the high life. He was flamboyant and fearless, and the press covered his every move, including the fact that he dared to date white women. From the moment Jack Johnson became champion, people began demanding that a white boxer be found who could dethrone him, put him back in his place, eradicate this glaring exception to white supremacy. And so, in 1910, a so-called Great White Hope agreed to fight Johnson. He was former heavyweight champion Joe Jeffries, who had retired 5 years earlier. This fight of the century took place in Reno, Nevada, in front of 20,000 people. Johnson battered Jeffries for 15 rounds before Jeffries' corner threw in the towel. As word of Jack Johnson's victory spread across the country, violent race riots exploded in more than 50 cities, resulting in dozens of deaths, mostly of African Americans. White Americans found Jack Johnson's success simply intolerable, and it became even more intolerable a year later, in 1911, when he married a white woman. Soon, federal authorities began looking for ways to take him down, and they found it in the form of a law called the Mann Act. This law made it illegal to transport a woman across state lines for, quote, immoral purposes. It was designed to curb prostitution, but in 1913, officials found one of Johnson's old white girlfriends and got her to testify against him. The all-white jury found Johnson guilty, and the judge sentenced him to 1 year in prison. Johnson fled the country, and he spent 7 years in exile, during which time he lost his heavyweight title. He eventually returned to the United States and served that year in prison. He'd never again have a shot at the heavyweight title. Jack Johnson had been put in his place.
You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
Okay, Edward T. O'Donnell here at In the Past Lane, and with me now is historian Lewis Moore. He is Associate Professor of History at Grand Valley State University in Michigan. His research, writing, and teaching focus on the interconnection between race, gender, and sports. Recently, Lou Moore published not one but two new books on race and sports in American history. The first, I Fight for a Living, Boxing and the Battle for Black Manhood, 1880 to 1915. And the second, We Will Win the Day, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Athlete, and the Quest for Equality. Lou Moore is here today to talk to me about both of these books. Lou Moore, welcome to In the Past Lane.
Thank you for having me.
I want to start by asking you how, as a historian, you came to focus on sports history, and in particular the history of the African-American athlete. What drew you to this particular topic?
Well, it's a couple of things. One, it was, undergrad research. I believe my senior year, we had to do our senior paper. I was at Cal State Sacramento. It's California history class. We could write anything, and I knew I wanted to do sports. And so we eventually, my professor and I settled on me doing the Jack Johnson-Jim Jeffrey fights that was supposed to take place in California. So, I just got totally into it, looking up, going to the state library, getting newspapers. This is before everything's online, right? All the microfilm. And that's when I was hand cranking and writing my notes. And I realized that, that I love sports. I love the black athlete, and I could do this, right? I could actually go to grad school and study this. And the professor, his name is Joseph Pitty, helped me, and he showed me the way.
Yeah, and I'm sure it wasn't very long before you realized this isn't just fascinating stories about black athletes. It's really fascinating stories about American history and crucial questions about race and equality and citizenship and capitalism and all that.
Right. That's what I learned, right? You could tell a lot of stories about just looking at the black athlete. I know it sounds cliche, but if you use sports as a window and the black athlete as a window, you're talking about progressivism, you're talking about masculinity, you're talking about class, you're talking about race, you're talking about mobility. All these things we talk about, like if you teach a general U.S. history class, you could do that through studying the black athlete.
Why don't we start with your first book, chronologically, I Fight for a Living, which looks at the story of African-American boxers and their emergence, between 1880 and 1915. So tell us, who are these African-American boxers and what accounts for their rise in the 1880s and in the initial decades, some pretty significant success?
Right. So some of them are well known, like a Jack Johnson or Joe Gans or a Peter Jackson. And I tried to tell their story, but I also wanted to get at the guys who most people haven't heard of. A guy like Henry Woodson, who comes from the bottoms of Cincinnati, or Joe Jeanette, or George Godfrey, or McHenry Johnson. These guys that don't get talked about, but still, they live their lives, right? They travel throughout America trying to fight for a living. And it's really trying to use these black men to get to understand working class black manhood on the one hand, and also kind of this offshoot of that, the sporting class. Like, what are guys doing in their leisure time? And then trying to figure out how the middle class and also white America responds to these guys who understand that through fighting, right, and earning money fighting, they could set themselves up differently in society.
Right. They could actually become quite wealthy, or if not wealthy, certainly very comfortable and enjoy the finer things of life. And that's one of the interesting points you make, which is that as these African-American boxers emerge and begin to enjoy success, middle-class African-Americans, elite African-Americans are a little bit nervous or resistant to this idea. Can you tell us more about that? What is it that makes them anxious about this particular high-profile African-American emerging in the late 19th century?
So there's a couple of things. On the one hand, they're worried about how much attention these guys are getting. You know, if you look in my own study, right, looking at newspapers in St. Paul, Minnesota, so between 1883 and 1887, a lot of the top black heavyweights go to live in St. Paul, Minnesota, and luckily there's a black newspaper there, a successful one, where we have a lot of the dates. But what you see is that these are the guys who are in the newspapers the most, right? Mm-hmm. You know, over 50 times if you look, because they're in the sports section, they're talked about. And so the black middle class is worried because these guys are getting attention. These guys then come to represent black manhood, but they're also worried that that's not the black manhood they want represented, right? These guys are going to the bars, and a few of them own bars. They're getting in trouble, they're gambling, and they're literally fighting to earn a living, whereas the black middle class want to highlight, you know, the guys who are saving money, investing in property, you know, sending their kids to school. And so they're taken aback by this, and they don't like this. But what happens, I believe I do this in both in chapter 1 and 2, I talk about this a lot, is that there's a boxer that's going to come around. His name is Peter Jackson, born in West Indies, grows up in Australia, comes to America to fight for the heavyweight championship. And the black middle class fall in love with him because they realize that he has the same thing they have. And that is, you know, he speaks well, he dresses well, the way he carries himself. And they're saying, wait a minute, this guy can represent us. And then all of a sudden they start to fall in love with sports because they see that sports can transcend some of these things they're fighting against, right? So if the guy can succeed in the ring, they'll start to make that argument that he can succeed in society, because in the ring to succeed, you need hard work and dedication. And what they're saying is, like, see, black people aren't lazy. Look at our champions.
Right. I think the key word that comes up again and again in this portion of the book is the idea of merit, that there's something important quality about sports that emphasizes merit, that you're not going to get there by being lazy or by being privileged. It's really who does what in the ring or on the, you know, baseball diamond.
Right. And sports allows you to prove that you could do, right?
Right.
Right. You win because you work hard. And I think that's one of the reasons why, starting in the 1880s, 1890s, a lot of black folks kind of gravitate towards sports.
Yeah, and what's interesting is also what happens outside the ring, which is that as some of these fighters accrue a pretty decent living, earning some significant money in the ring, they use this money in particular ways, and they're very open about it. They invest in properties, they invest in businesses. Sometimes it's sports-related things like bars and gymnasiums, and they're very open about it, and they talk a lot about it. Again, as a way to sort of emphasize that they're doing what good capitalist middle-class Americans do. When they get cash, they invest it.
Many of them straddle two lines, right? On the one hand, we're, middle-class, manliness, we're going to prove this, via what we do in a capitalist society. And on the other hand, there's still these guys who come from the sporting culture. So they try to figure out, both ways. How can I prove my manhood in this culture that is all about consumption and proving what you have via money versus proving my toughness and stuff like that, hanging out with the fellas. But, Joe Gans bought a hotel. George Godfrey had $40,000 worth of property. So these guys are thinking about these things. And I think the coolest part is that they're openly talking about it. And I think they're openly talking about it as a way to prove to society. These guys aren't dumb. They know that most of the people who are reading this are white men, right? And so they're having these conversations with a white reporter to a white audience about, having economic discipline. And I think that's fascinating. And I wanted to tell that story because that's not often told, right? We're often seeing these guys just kind of throwing away their money,
right?
Just living that lifestyle, but they're thinking about what their future should be.
I guess another question that comes to mind is, could you tell us a little bit more about the success that some of these folks have? How broad and important was the success, and how important was the idea of what they call mixed bouts? These are where an African-American and a white boxer face off. These seem to be very important in the early part of your book and then become increasingly problematic towards the second half.
Right. Mixed bouts are the most important bouts, right?
Mm-hmm. Because
boxing is about manhood, and it's pretty clear it's about racial superiority. And that's easy, right, for white people and white fans to invest in that idea when white fighters can draw the color line. They say, well, I'm not going to fight this black fighter. I'm not going to waste my time. And so white fans can say, yes, we have this champion. We're the best. What happens, though, is if this sport is truly about manhood, then eventually you're going to have to fight. Moreover, what fighters know is that interracial fights make the most money. So these guys come from, white or black. Most of them come from the same place. They're in the ring to make money. And so they look at, the revenue more than the race, so to speak. And they'll have these fights, and we can count how many black men win these major fights against white opponents. And so for a section of the book, I talk about progressive reform and mixed bouts. And I give a stat that early in 1900s, only one black fighter lost to a white guy in Los Angeles. The reason why I bring up Los Angeles is because there's a promoter there, Tom McCary, who is intentionally putting on black versus white fights because he understands the economics of this. He's trying to grow his base, his boxing base, and he knows that a black fighter versus a white fighter will draw the most fans. The problem is black fighters win and white fans start to complain. And so you have him stop doing those fights, but in other cities, they'll just completely ban it, right? City law. Baltimore will ban it. Louisville will essentially tell black fighters they can't work there anymore. Of course, all in the South, it's banned. And then New York will do the same thing. Wisconsin will do the same thing. And that's because these fans and these legislators know that what they've been telling themselves over these years about white superiority is disproved in the ring.
Right. And it becomes a problematic thing. And so the way to end that question is to ban it. And part of the excuse for banning interracial boxing or these mixed bouts is that there's often a lot of violence outside of the ring that erupts. I mean, the most famous example probably, which is the one that I think you mentioned was your original research project, was the Jack Johnson-Jim Jeffries fight in 1910 when Johnson defeats Jeffries and serious rioting explodes across the country. Not something we typically associate with boxing matches, but certainly was in that era. Tell us more about what's the nature of that rioting and response, and how does that play into the ultimate ending of interracial boxing?
Yeah, so that fight's 1910. It is one of those fights you label as a fight, essentially, perhaps one of the most important fights ever. So Jack Johnson's the heavyweight champion. Jim Jeffries, retired champion in 1905. He's the white hope. He's coming out of retirement to, save white America. And when they realize that it's not going their way, right, Jack Johnson wins, you have mass riots. So I believe 19 black people are killed. I did a story map, one of those things, about most of the riots across the country that happened. So if you look up story map, Jack Johnson, Jim Jeffries, for your listeners, you could kind of follow these riots across the country that happened.
Okay, I'll put a link to that on our show page.
Right. So these riots are just white people being upset. They had bet on Jeffries. They believed that Jeffries would defeat Johnson, and also meaning that black people would be put back in their place. And once Johnson won, they worried, like, what if they're all like Jack Johnson? We can't control them. And so the riots are meant to control black people and immediately try to put them back in their place. I mean, it's not the first time. Most of the fighting will happen, after a black person or white person fight. They'll be in the stands. Very rarely does it spill over. But Jack Johnson, that Jeffries fights, that's just a culmination of just years and years of openly talking about race and racism in the press when it comes to boxing.
It's also, I think we should remind our listeners what's going on nationally. The very years of this book, 1880 to 1915, is when Jim Crow is being created and implemented throughout the country. And it's affecting essentially every walk of life, including other sports. So if you look at the Kentucky Derby, the great majority of the early winners of the Kentucky Derby were African-American jockeys. But by, say, 1900, there are no more black jockeys allowed in the Kentucky Derby. And same thing, professional baseball had many African-American players, Moses Walker and others. And by 1890, 1900, they're all gone. So boxing is part of a larger segregation that's taking place across the country.
Right. And I think the last chapter, I try to kind of tap into that. And really, the major difference in boxing is that it's man versus man in the ring, right? And these black fighters dominate. And so this is, white Americans like, oh my gosh, we got migration. We're trying to put forth the Jim Crow laws. Yet inside this ring, when we have black and white men together, these black men are seen as physically superior. What do? The only reaction is to stop it altogether.
Yeah, just to remove the problem through segregation.
Right.
Well, why don't we jump now, with the time that we have left, to your second book, which in some ways not quite perfectly, chronologically meshes with your first one, but We Will Win the Day, which looks at African-American athletes and the civil rights movement. And you start in some ways with a conventional story with Jackie Robinson, 1947. And towards the end of the book, the focus is on the 1968 Olympics and the famous protest by Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the 1968 Olympics, raising their fists in the symbol of Black power. But in between, you chronicle many stories and many people that, most of us have never heard of, these unsung figures of the civil rights movement, and in this case, that are tied to athletics. So tell us about the way you thought about, you conceived of the book and really chose to focus on these lesser known stories to kind of fill in the gaps.
So when I got asked to write this book, I thought it would be a lot easier than it was. I'm thinking, I know this stuff. And then when I looked at what's been written, it's mainly, Jackie, and then there's a quick shift to the mid-1960s with Ali. And then there's the information on the 68 Olympics. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much to fill in here. How do I do this? So what I did is I just got a bunch of black newspapers,
right?
The ones I couldn't get access to online. And I, for 2 years, I microfilmed them, I PDF, I took notes. And so I just told that story, that in-between story, through the eyes of the black press, from around the country. I made sure I got stuff that nobody had access to unless you went to a library and sat down in front of the microfilm for hours. And this is why you get the stories about the unsung. Because they weren't really unsung to the community. It's just unsung to us because we focus so much on Jackie, on Muhammad Ali, on John Carlos and Tommy Smith. And I knew that there's an in-between, and I wanted to tell that story. I wanted to show the readers that there are these kind of interlinking stories that are going on throughout. And on the one hand, they're different, but on the other hand, they all link to each other.
Could you provide us with an example of one of these incidents that wouldn't have made it into the mainstream press and certainly not into the historical memory, but that it was important in its day, or at least important in its community, where the tie between African-American athletes and the civil rights movement is pretty clear?
Yeah, so the last chapter on the revolt of the black athlete, I started it with this lady, Rosanna Robbins, and she was a high jumper from Chicago. She's a member, of course, Congress for Racial Equality. And in 1958, she makes a spot on the U.S. track team, the team that goes against Russia.
Yep.
It's kind of goodwill games. And she refuses to go. And she says, look, I'm not going to let you use my athleticism for political purposes. So what's happening is, starting in the 50s, America is using black athletes, right, to go across different countries to prove that even though we have Jim Crow, black people can still make it. And she's saying, no, I don't believe in this. I don't want to be used this way. I don't want my tax dollars to go to the Cold War when there's too many people here in poverty and the school system's no good. And so she's really one of these first athletes, and we never talk about it, right? One, she's a woman, and two, she's not, famous like some of these other women, like Wilma Rudolph at that time. But she's one who risked it all, right? We celebrate people like Kaepernick or Ali because they risked it all. She's probably the first one to do that. So I wanted to lead off with her.
Yeah. Professional athletics is also part of this story as well. And there's some really interesting stories about early civil rights efforts regarding the NFL. And it really affects, these efforts actually shape the future of the NFL in terms of where franchises go. So maybe you could tell our listeners more about those links.
So I talk about the NFL integration in two places. One, there's a chapter called White Allies, right? So I wanted to highlight, white folks who helped with the integration cause. And that chapter talks about football, baseball, and bowling. And so in football, I talk about the Cleveland Browns and how we celebrate them, right? They're one of the first teams that integrate. And I talk about the role of Paul Brown, who always said, I don't care what color you are as long as you could play. And we love that story. And then I quickly go to the Los Angeles Rams, who integrate, in the NFL at that same time. And I essentially say we don't tell this story because part of the reason why you have integration with the Los Angeles Rams is because the black community and the black press pushed for it. Mm-hmm. They made the Rams integrate. They made the Rams give, Kenny Washington, Willie Strode a tryout. And that's not as glamorous or sexy to tell, right? The sexy stories are Paul Brown and Branch Rickey to tell. The other stories about the black press having to push for integration, that tells us a different story about who we are as Americans. And then in chapter 3, I look more into the black press. And as they go into those final barriers to break, right, trying to get complete integration in MLB. So I talk about the Tigers and the Red Sox, integration in golf, and then complete integration in football. And so that's a conversation about the Washington Redskins team and how the black press and black fans in many cities, New York, D.C., San Francisco, L.A., and then they protested in Philly, right, protested Washington for not signing a black player.
Yeah, and, in terms of the evolving future of the NFL, some cities like Atlanta, which are sort of positioning themselves as progressive cities that are, too busy to hate and are eager to become modern cities, they realize that either rolling back segregation or eliminating it in certain places is kind of key to that national image that they're aspiring to. They also realize that they need, in order to be a really respectable, legit, world-class city, they need professional franchises. So they eventually get the Atlanta Braves and then eventually the Falcons. But tell us more about how they approach this question of race and segregation as a way to lure these franchises.
So Atlanta, as you said, Atlanta will do this, New Orleans will do this, and Houston will do this, right? And so these are the three major southern cities who are trying to prove somehow that they're not the South. They're the South, but they are not like those other cities. And the way you do that is to get, as you say, to get a franchise. But in order to do that, you have to desegregate your city. And Atlanta does that, rather quickly in the mid-1960s, and boom, they get the Braves, and boom, they get the Falcons, and then they get the Hawks. And to say they desegregated the city doesn't mean that the players didn't struggle with racism. And we've seen like a number of the Falcons complain about that. But it sets, that standard that you can get over this with sports. But it also tells us something too, like in today's modern sports, that if these leagues want to do something, like if we're talking about the NFL and protests, if we just kind of get to that, they can do something, right? They don't have to have cities spend $1 billion on a new stadium, right, to get the Super Bowl. They could have cities spend money on dealing with police and community relationships, or dealing with poverty, or dealing with something else if they want the Super Bowl. The NFL did this with New Orleans Saints, right? New Orleans wanted to be like Atlanta. That's who they're competing with. Okay, Atlanta has a baseball team. Atlanta has a football team. What are we going to do? New Orleans lost their minor league baseball team because of racism. Tell the story where the black fan base, led by the black press, boycotted, and their minor league team had to shut down. And so in the 60s, like, wow, how are we going to be a major league city? Let's get a football team. How do we do this? We have to follow Atlanta's model. And the NFL made them promise to integrate the city. And so the mayor of New Orleans, the governor of New Orleans, went to the NFL and said, look, if you give us a franchise, we'll integrate the city. And that's what happened. Of course, it doesn't mean that racism goes away, because it's still there. But, you do these things. Houston did the same thing with baseball. MLB said you have to integrate the city, right? You can't have Hank Aaron coming there. You can't have Ernie Banks and Willie Mays coming there and then staying in segregated hotels. So all, three of these cities, Houston, New Orleans, and Atlanta, to prove that they're modern, integrate their sports. But at the same time, the major league sports made sure that they integrated before they got a team.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like you said, these leagues at that time seemed to be willing to coerce, in some ways, cities to do the right thing, right, and to desegregate, even if it's to some degree superficial. It's important in terms of the larger what's going on in society in the 1960s. And today, maybe we could kind of move towards today, because it seems inevitable.
Right.
Today, the leagues seem to be really nervous about engaging with some of these questions, and maybe because desegregation in some ways is an easier thing to do than to address questions about inequality, police violence, and so forth. But, I always ask the historians I interview to explain why their work that they've done, their most recent book usually, why it is relevant today. What does it tell us today? And I don't think we have to work too hard to get you to do that, because I've seen you on social media and on NPR and various places talking about these issues in 2017, because there's been so much talk of it with Colin Kaepernick and other NFL players protesting police violence, and more recently, President Trump's attacks on them and NBA stars like Steph Curry. It seems pretty clear that these issues are alive and well, even if some of the specific issues are different. Race, sports, and politics and power seem very much on the front burner these days. Can you tell us more about that?
Right. Chapters 6 and 7 really talk about the activist athlete and how athletes come to this, right? And how they're pushed into this movement and why people wanted them to be in this movement. And it's the same thing with today, right? Look, Derrick Rose was in his high-rise apartment in Chicago in, 2014, when he heard people chanting. He looked down, it's the Black Lives Matter rally. That next game, he has I Can't Breathe shirt. And other NBA players do the same thing, right? They get pushed into this. And I think that studying this stuff from the past kind of helps us to understand, like, what athletes can do with their platform, but also helps us realize that sometimes sports, like, we put a lot on sports. And as I say in some of my writings, that sports can't save us if we're not willing to do stuff in society. So I had this piece in the U.S. Sports History blog after Charlottesville. And Charlottesville in that city, University of Virginia, right? Harvard had a black player in 1947. So what is it, 70 years ago, if my math is correct? The first black player to play, in a predominantly white team against a white Southern school in the South was a black man, Chet Pierce, at Harvard. And some of the same stuff they talked about in those articles, 70 years ago occurred today. And that is that those statues were up, right? This black guy had to go see these Confederate statues, right? He had to go walk through this racist Jim Crow town. And when he played in this game, there's tons of Confederate flags. And what happens is the press celebrated that moment 70 years ago. Like, we're moving this right direction of democracy. America's this great place. But 70 years later, the statues still stand. The Confederate flags still fly. And that's because people didn't want to get rid of those statues, right? We just want to use sports, as I call it, this kind of moral evasion, right? Where we don't have to deal with what's going on in society. We could just celebrate what's going on in the field and kind of project to the future. And if we could go 70 years later, what Kaepernick did, and this is why so many people are upset with him, especially the owners, why they're not letting him back in, is that he forced us to deal with racism, right? Like, you can't use sports as an escape, and that's why people are mad. Like, you talk to anybody, right? Even your students, I just want to watch this game. And Kaepernick said no for, 2 minutes, no. And then afterwards, you have to deal with this. And that's why people are mad, because as a country, for the most part, we don't want to have to deal with racism, and we don't want to have to deal with the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and structural racism. And that's what happened, and that's where these athletes are now. These are the people who are at the forefront of this movement, especially the football players who continue to kneel, and they're the ones who are going to continue this conversation.
Yeah, and they're the ones who are potentially facing the consequences from an economic standpoint, because Kaepernick is, he's not the greatest quarterback out there, but he's certainly better than many of the backups that are currently in the league. And he's paying a price for it. And I'm sure that's on the minds of many other athletes who are trying to think about their own, especially NFL players. The window of time in which you are a player is very short.
Right.
So it's a difficult bind. It's a lot put on those players. And if the focus is on the players, then it's in some ways away from the league. And I guess that's the question, is how to have them both share the burden a little bit.
Yeah, and I don't know. So the league is committed to $89 to $100 million to these causes over 7 years. And if you break it down, it's not a lot, right?
No.
It's not a lot. And they don't want to deal with it, right? Because in their mind, it doesn't exist. I think when you get to $1 billion, you tell yourself different stories. And you forget that there's so much privilege,
right?
And all of these owners but one are white. And you are able to ignore the fact that, your stadium was built with public dollars, and those dollars then take away from public education and take away some other things that make it hard for a lot of these people to grow up in your city. And you convince yourself that you're doing something good because you provide $8 an hour jobs selling hot dogs. And so they don't want to deal with police brutality because in their mind, I'm doing something good. 70% of my roster is African American. I'm very nice to them. I give them Christmas parties or whatever.
Right.
So I don't think they're ever going to be willing to share that burden. I don't think billionaires do that. Right? They get their money and they tell themselves stories about how successful they are.
It's very interesting, and I think we're only at the beginning of this chapter of activist athletes and the kind of pressure that they might or might not be able to bring to bear on their leagues and also on society as a whole. So, well, Lou, this has been a really interesting conversation and one that's very thought-provoking given how closely tied it is with current events. So I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us at In the Past Lane.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for reading the books.
All right, you bet. Lewis Moore is the author of 2 new books. I Fight for a Living, Boxing in the Battle for Black Manhood, 1880 to 1915, published by the University of Illinois Press, and We Will Win the Day, The Civil Rights Movement, the Black Athlete, and the Quest for Equality, published by Praeger. You can also find Lou on Twitter under the handle @ProfLouMoore. Okay, people, that's all for this episode of In the Past Lane. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. And tell your friends about In the Past Lane. That really helps to bring in new listeners. For more information about the many things we talked about today, head over to our show page for this episode at inthepastlane.com. I also want to hear from you, so please send us your comments, questions, and suggestions via Twitter, Instagram, and our Facebook page. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the past lane. Hey, Lulu, you want to come to my Super Bowl party?
Oh, that would be fabulous.
Really?
No.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.